Okay, good night, everyone. Now I hand over to Jacques Manique, who will introduce our next lecturer. Please, Jacques. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Dear sisters, dear brothers, dear friends. For this session, we will now embark for a new destination, almost a new planet, the one where science can illuminate theosophy and vice versa. This place has often attracted many bright minds because it is a very exciting world, full of experiments, models, big data, which can provide us with glimpses of the physical reality into which we are embedded. But this world can also be treacherous when the appearances are taken for the ultimate truth. So, to talk about the bridges between the two, science and theosophy, requires an outstanding, a knowledgeable and experienced soul in both domains. We are fortunate to have such a lecturer with us today. Professor Ravi Ravindra is a life member of the Theosophical Society. He is well known in our communities, having taught many schools of the wisdom in Adyar, India, and in Crotona, California. He is Professor Emeritus at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Canada, where he had taught physics, philosophy, and comparative religion. He is the author of many books, including Science and the Sacred. His today's lecture is about scientific research and spiritual search. We are pleased to welcome Professor Ravi Ravindra.
Thank you very much, Jacques. Let me begin with two obvious facts. One of them is that I did not create myself. It's obvious, but if one can actually come back to this realization again and again, it can change one's whole life. So I invite you to consider this seriously, that I did not create myself. Secondly, that the universe is very large. These days we speak in terms of trillions of galaxies, and we are in a very ordinary galaxy. And even in that galaxy, we are not at the center of it. We are around a peripheral star. So there is no need for us to feel very self-important about all this. On the other hand, there is a enunciation by practically all the sages in the history of humanity that the entire space is permeated by subtle and conscious energies. Naturally, the labels vary from culture to culture, language to language. They may say it's filled with God. God is omnipresent, or filled with Brahma, or Allah, or the Holy Spirit, or simply the Absolute, or because of difficulty of describing it, just simply that, the One. So there are varieties of ways of saying this. But the reason I'm bringing this out now is to remind ourselves that from the perspective of the spiritual teachings, because these energies which are permeating the whole universe and are creating the whole universe are conscious, therefore our existence is not completely random. That there is a purpose behind it, to discover which is really part of our undertaking. So the very fundamental questions that naturally arise. Why am I here in this such large universe in which I did not create myself? But these kinds of inquiries are not new. The oldest text in any Indo-European language is Rigveda. And let me actually bring to your attention one of the questions that is raised in the Rigveda. Na vijanami yadi vedamasmi ninya sanadha manasa charami. I do not know whether I am the same as this cosmos, yet burdened by my mind, I wander. See, our mind is always thinking about this or that. But what has also happened, that to approach any kind of knowledge, particularly since the great revolution in the 16th, 17th century, really starting from Copernicus's book, The Revolution of the Heavenly Spheres, that's the English translation, and until Newton's publication of the Philosophia Natural, Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy in English. One of the remarks I want to make here is that that is really not, strictly speaking, a revolution in science. That is actually a revolution which created science, what we now call science. So it's really a revolution in thought. What is going to be considered science? We have since then had major revolutions in science, but some of the very basic principles or basic assumptions have continued to be the same since the 16th, 17th century. And since the very word science is a Latin word which literally means knowledge, so since the publication of Newton's book, particularly towards the end of the 17th century, science has become more or less almost as if it has the monopoly of knowledge. Literally, the word science in Latin does mean knowledge. And what I want to simply remind you, the obvious fact that this is a special kind of knowledge, because in all spiritual teachings also, there is a great deal of emphasis on knowledge. In fact, let me take a moment here to remind you, very strong emphasis, more particularly in the Indian spiritual traditions and in the Judeo-Christian tradition, especially one would find this in the so-called Gnostic Gospels. The very word Gnostic, in fact, really does mean subtler knowledge, gnosis. But in general, the churches tend to interfere with spiritual search. I don't want to speak about it very much here, but what I'm speaking about is nothing to do with what religions may call something or the other. I am much more interested to see what is it that a scientist is trying to do when he or she is engaged in doing science, scientific research. Similarly, what is it that a spiritual searcher is trying to do when he or she is engaged in spiritual search? So that is really the main theme of my talk today. So not generally what gets called science and religion, because one can understand many different things by these words these days. For some people, science itself has become a religion, as if there can be no knowledge other than through science. So let me come back to this idea that there is a certain kind of knowledge which science is occupied with. And otherwise, for example, one can see this in the Yoga Sutras or in the Bhagavad Gita, such a strong emphasis in saying that the root cause of all our troubles is avidya or agyan. Both of them literally means ignorance. So what is called for is knowledge. Similarly, in the Gospel, for example, of Gospel of Philip, you can happily read there that the main cause of all our problem is ignorance, and that we need to find the right kind of knowledge. So it is very important for us to understand that science literally does mean knowledge, but it does not have a monopoly of knowledge. It's a certain kind of knowledge. And that is based on certain very fundamental assumptions, both in what is now called science. Most of these assumptions actually began in the 16th, 17th century and continue now. And there are certain attitudes or assumptions, if you like, in spiritual search. So let me speak a little bit about both of them so that we know what the distinctions are. In a way, it is, as I just quoted from the Rigveda, whether I am the same as this cosmos. So one could hardly not be interested both in trying to understand the nature of the cosmos and nature of oneself. But these two inquiries require slightly different attitude, different kind of understanding. So let me first of all point out that in the general assumption of modern science, by the way, again, one should remind each other that what we these days call science really began, strictly speaking, in the 16th, 17th century. It's not that there was no science earlier, by which I mean that there was no knowledge earlier. No, what these days we call science has a certain kind of specific qualities to it. So one of them is that everything in the universe begins from the lowest level of consciousness, from matter without any consciousness. This is completely contrary to the general assumption in all spiritual teachings, according to which everything in the universe comes from the highest level of consciousness. Whether you call it God or some other label, that's a different matter. So from the perspective of scientific knowledge, things begin from the lowest level of consciousness, and gradually, somehow material particles come together, creating life, and then somehow consciousness emerges. But it's matter which is the primary reality. In the spiritual realm, it's consciousness which is the primary reality. So from the spiritual perspective, the manifested universe is not by evolution, it is by involution. Because as we can see in the manifested universe, there are many creatures at different levels of consciousness, and correspondingly, there is different kind of material manifestation. But all of this is nevertheless originating from or starting from the highest level of consciousness. And then what is also implied here is a very important idea that although the manifested universe, different creatures are at different levels of consciousness, but that at each level, every creature wishes to evolve, as it were, to come back to God, to come home. I could give you many references of this kind if you like, but I have rather limited time, so I would not stay. I'm not trying to promote my book, but many of these things are discussed at great length in my book, Science and the Sacred, published by the Theosophical Publishing House in Adyar, as well as slightly different version in Quest Books in the USA. However, the point to be made is this, that every level of reality is wishing to evolve. So whatever particle of divinity has created me, the reason for creating me, by me I here mean my body and my mind, which is what we usually call myself. So the very reason why this particle of divinity or the breath of God, that is the expression used in the book of Genesis, for example, why this particle of divinity has created my body mind is so that some particular action can be undertaken, because as is completely rightly said, spirit without body is lame and body without the spirit is blind. So for this element of the spirit to evolve, it needs to undertake some action. Therefore, it needs a body and the mind. So what's the implication of this? That my body and mind, I will simply now use the word body just for simplicity, but it includes the mind. that my body is meant to be an instrument to assist the evolution of the element of the spirit, which is at a particular level, but it is wishing to evolve to come to the highest level. That is the call in every spiritual teaching, to become one with God. We have very classical expressions of this. For example, the Buddha saying, look within, you are the Buddha. Or in the Upanishads, I am Brahma. Or classical expression, you are that. Similarly, as I said, generally in the Judeo-Christian tradition, it gets left out, but you can find this in the Gnostic Gospels. For example, the Gospel of Philip. I'm quoting it. Christ came not to make us Christians, but to make us Christ. And what does it mean to become Christ? In fact, even in the canonical Gospels, you can find this in the very beginning of John's Gospel, that whosoever would actually follow the teaching and would act from the Spirit will become a son of God. That's the call. And Christ himself, not always, but at the highest level of consciousness, or I sometimes call it the Mount Sinai of consciousness, actually said, the Father and I are one. That is the call for everybody, for all of us to become brothers and sisters of Christ, just like him to become sons and daughters of God, and eventually, at whatever level, to become one with God. There is no need to fantasize that this is easy. In fact, all of the great sages themselves have said, for example, Christ, this is one of the remarks of Christ, many are called, but few are chosen. Similarly, in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says, out of thousands of people who would hear what I'm saying, very few will undertake the corresponding practice. And out of those thousands who undertake the practice, very, very few will in fact come to my level of being. But the call is, for example, in Krishna repeatedly says in the Bhagavad Gita, call is to come to his level of being, to come to oneness with God. That is the search of every spiritual searcher. Not an easy task. Even Siddhartha Gautama had to go through many lifetimes before he could become Buddha. So no need to fantasize that it is an easy project. But on the other hand, similarly, of course, in the scientific world, the wish is to find one theory, which one perspective, one idea that will clarify everything that we see in the universe. A theory of everything. It's not so easy. The greatest scientists, and I will come back to this again and again, I will take the examples mostly from Newton and Einstein, perhaps the two greatest scientists in the history of humanity. Similarly, much of what I would end up saying will be really said either by Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita, or by the Buddha, or by Christ, because these are the greatest sages in the history of humanity. So therefore, no need to diminish any of their qualities, but to try to understand what is it that they are aiming at? What are they trying? What are they focusing on? So let me return to what I was saying in between. What are some of the underlying perspectives? As I just said, in the scientific research, the primary reality is matter. In the spiritual search, the primary reality is consciousness. Which is why, starting, first of all, I should also remind you that from the 17th century onward, physics has been regarded more or less as the queen of the sciences. Every other science wants to be more or less like physics, or even the biologists ultimately hope that everything can be explained in terms of physical theories. What is the project of physics? To study matter in motion. Of course, our understanding of matter has changed through theory of relativity. What is motion? Motion includes space and time. So this is not such an easy task. Nevertheless, starting from the 17th century, primary reality was described in terms of mass, length, and time. And then in the 19th century, charge was added to it because it was difficult to describe charge in terms of mass, length, and time. And then in the 20th century, spin coming from quantum mechanics was added to it. I don't want to go into too many details here, but the point I'm more trying to make is that the primary reality is matter. So the ultimate idea is, how can we describe everything in terms of qualities of matter? Whereas in the spiritual world, primary reality is consciousness. Of course, manifested world is at many different levels. This is obvious. But one needs to be very clear. Why have you or I been created? So it's not that somehow my body has the soul. It's the other way around. The soul needs a body. Therefore, it has taken on my body. So I am meant to be the instrument. But in this context, one should also be clear. Sometimes there is a tendency in the spiritual world to somehow ignore the body or even to neglect it. This is quite silly. This is meant to be the instrument. So the instrument needs to be taken care of. It needs to be sharpened. It needs to actually assist the evolution of the particle of divinity that has taken on this instrument for its purposes, not for the purpose of the body, but for the purpose of the particle of the spirit. Or to use another expression, this is from St. Paul, that our body is the temple of the spirit. It is silly to be against the temple. In fact, the temple needs to be clean, it needs to be taken care of, so that the spirit, whenever it can actually descend at the right moment, can actually be experienced by somebody there. But at the same time, a good reminder that if one gets so occupied just by fixing the temple, arranging thicker walls or thinner walls, or having more air conditioning or less, that is not going to assist the descent of the spirit in the body. So one needs to find the right usage of my body and mind to become the appropriate instrument for the evolution of this particle of divinity that has taken on this body and mind. The purpose of this whole end, purpose of my existence is not to assist the body and the mind to rise, because it has been repeatedly said, and one can see this in one's own experience, that the body-mind, usual body-mind, is driven by desire and fear, which is why whenever, first of all, just to be clear, it's easy to say that I wish to come back home, come back to God, but this is not only a large, long process, but there are many, many obstacles. There are many tempters. For example, most of you are familiar with how the Buddha to be, before he was the Buddha, was tempted by Mara, which is the Buddhist equivalent of the devil, if you like, or Satan. What is the temptation? So Mara says to the Buddha, he sends his own daughters to seduce him. Sometimes it is said 3 daughters, sometimes 7 daughters, but even one will do. But this is one thing, but that doesn't work. And the Buddha himself actually is said in the Buddhist tradition, he said that if there was one other force as strong as sex, he's not sure he would have made it. This is a great force. The whole of Prakriti, or the whole of nature exists. You and I exist because of sexual energy, sexual power. So there is no need to be against any of this, but one needs to understand its right place. The Buddha himself had his a son, Rahul. So it's not that he did not experience sex, but he is not going to be deviated from his search now. And what is causing his search? Because he sees an old man, a sick man, and a dead man. There is nobody in the audience here, I imagine, who has not seen all of these things. But the Buddha to be took it very existentially. almost very personally, that I too will die, my son will die, my father will die. Therefore, his whole search begins from recognizing the ordinary human condition, the fact that whatever I call myself will die. It is amazing that I exist, but only for a few decades. This is a constant reminder from all the great traditions. In fact, it used to be a very common practice in Buddhist and Christian monasteries. When a monk met another monk, they would say, "Brother, remember death." If I can remember that whatever I call myself usually is transient, which is exactly what the Buddha to be recognized. And then he's searching for something which is not transient. And this makes his search. And then Mara naturally wants to deviate him from this. So first of all, he sends his daughter. Then he says, I will turn this mountain into a mountain of gold. Now, I ask myself, and I invite all of you, would $1 million do for you? Or $1 billion? A whole mountain of gold? One needs to realize that these are precisely the reason why Mara is testing him, the Buddha to be, with these factors, because this is what is driving all of us. Look in the world right now. So then that doesn't work. Then he says, I will give you sovereignty over the whole world. So power, wealth, pleasure. If you look honestly, sincerely inside yourself, which is actually a fundamental requirement of any spiritual search. I'll come back to this in a moment. Self-study. But then you will see these are exactly what is driving most of our time and energy during the day. I often remind myself and my friends, if you just look at your checkbook and your calendar, that will tell you what is driving your life. Or I get many, many spams in my emails, and I look at them. What are they trying to seduce me by? I can assure you, it is always to do with more money, more sex, or more power, more wealth. So these are driving forces. And therefore, the suggestion very strongly that unless I can be free of this usual worldly self, or the other side, by the way, I should have mentioned, is fear. When Mara does not succeed by bringing all the temptations to the Buddha or Buddha to be, then he sends his armies to try to kill him. When that also does not work, here I want to take a moment here. First of all, just to remind you that Mara, or by the way, Jesus Christ was also tested by the devil, that the Satan or Mara are also created by God. They are actually among the most faithful servants of God. People often forget this. Nobody, you can look at any of the prophets in the whole of the Bible, or any of the sages from the Indian tradition or any other tradition, nobody can come to whatever we mean by enlightenment or heaven or kingdom of God or whatever other label you want to use there. Nobody can come to them without being tested. So the devil or Satan or Mara is the examiner. He's the head examiner. And if I become against them, they will fail me. So it's not a good idea to be against the devil. Devil is also a faithful servant of God. In fact, if you're interested in the Bible, look in the book of Job. Twice, both in the first chapter and the second chapter, it is said, when all the sons of God were gathered together, among them was Satan. He's also a son of God. He didn't create himself. His presence is necessary. Maybe if you want to put this in more modern mind, like this sort of thing that psychologists will speak about these days. unless you see your own shadow and overcome it, there is no possibility of coming to any real understanding. But in any case, Satan is much more interesting than the shadow, at least from my point of view. But what does the Buddha say to Mara before his enlightenment? He says, Mara, you are a part and parcel of myself. What did Christ say? Christ says to the Satan, get thee behind me, Satan. You can look this in the Gospel of Luke. They're not asking them to disappear or go to hell or just go away. They have a lot, these devils have a lot of energy. Watch within yourself. All these egotistic tendencies, all success in the world, etc., is a lot of energy. Question is not therefore to be against that or against this energy or to be against my body or my mind. Question more is to find their proper place, right place. My own teacher, Madame de Salzman, she was a very responsible person in the teaching of Gurdjieff. And she actually made this remark that ego is a good servant, but a bad master. Who needs a servant who just wants to lie around and do nothing? But if the servant begins to run all the decisions in the household, that's where the problem comes. So there is no need to be against the ego. Ego, every serious remark of Christ begins with the word ego. Ego simply really means I or Atma in Sanskrit. But one can be complete, this has many levels. One can be completely selfish or occasionally completely selfless. This is the call. For example, a remark of Christ in the Gospel of Matthew, unless you leave yourself behind, you cannot be a follower of mine. Similarly, a very ancient text in India, Shatapatha Brahman. Actually, this is a remark from there. When a searcher comes to the sun door, he will be asked, who is it? If the answer is anything other than nobody, he may not enter. So it's really the whole search actually is to do with more and more freedom from my usual self, so that the real self can actually manifest through my body and my mind, through my activities. Therefore, no need to be against the ordinary self to find it to be the proper instrument to assist the evolution of the real particle of divinity that has taken on my body mind. So let me return again to pointing out that in the scientific realm, beginning from the material world, therefore very strong suggestion that everything should be able to be explained in terms of some principles coming from physics. Whatever we now call cosmology is essentially physical cosmology. There is a very strong, one may say assumption, if you like, but a very strong assertion in all spiritual teachings that there are many levels of reality subtler than the body and the mind. In fact, this is almost the very meaning of the word spiritual. Spiritual almost literally means something subtler than the mind. But the spiritual realm is very large. Just to remind you, for example, in the Bible, you will find 9 orders of angels between human beings and God. They're all spiritual. So sometimes one may have one extraordinary parapsychological experience, and to imagine that now I'm at the level of Christ or the Buddha is quite crazy. No, it's a very large realm. So as I just, very, very large realm, but subtler than the mind, which is why every serious spiritual teaching very much encourages to find situations, often to do with meditation, in which the mind can be quiet. Just to remind you, this is a remark of Madame Blavatsky. Mind is the slayer of the truth. Ordinary mind actually belongs to the opposing team. So the very substantial first sutra in the Yoga Sutra is actually the second sutra in the first chapter, is yoga is stopping all the movements of the mind. That is the call. Can my mind become quiet? And in fact, Krishnamurti, when he speaks about meditation, he said, you don't have to sit down somewhere in lotus position or whatever. Whenever the mind can be a little quiet, whenever one can be a little free of the mind, that is the state of meditation. In fact, for many people, it is much more assisted by going for a walk in wilderness or by looking at something very large, such as the sky with the stars shining or the ocean. Just as whenever we become aware of the largeness of the cosmos, then one is not so convinced that I can fill the whole cosmos here. Then one begins to see that I am merely a drop in the whole ocean of being. But the call from all the great sages. This is actually a remark of a great Sufi sage in India, Kabir, saying, if the drop can connect with the whole ocean, then in a way the whole ocean is in the drop. This is a very remarkable statement of Kabir. In any case, let me now come back to the point I was trying to make, that from the perspective of the spiritual tradition, since the call is to become one with God, it requires to be a little bit freed of my usual association with myself, that I am this body and this mind, which is running the whole universe. So this is nothing so surprising. But therefore, the fundamental requirement in any spiritual practice is self-inquiry. Because unless I know what is the self that is occupying me, what is holding me down here, how can I be free of this? So very strong requirement in absolutely every spiritual search is on impartial self-study or self-knowledge or self-observation, self-inquiry. Many words get used. Don't get attached to one word or the other. But and there is also a very important principle here. Let me actually mention the principle that self-awareness is the mechanism of self-transformation. Because the call is for a radical transformation of my being from my usual worldly self to become one with, if you like, a capital S self, one with God. It requires a radical transformation, or sometimes it is even called a whole new birth is required. And it is silly to imagine, as actually some of you can read this in the 3rd chapter of John's Gospel, Nicodemus, who comes to Christ, asks him, how can I enter heaven? And Christ says to him, a whole new birth is required. And Nicodemus, literally the word means the ruler of men. But how absolutely ridiculous his question is. How can an old man like me re-enter the womb of his mother? See, this is a very strong tendency everywhere to take things literal-mindedly. Similarly, the so-called virgin birth is taken very literal-mindedly. It's really, virgin birth is the spiritual birth. In any case, I don't want to get into more details of this unless there are questions later on. Let me return to, first of all, suggesting again the great importance placed on impartial, deep self-study or self-inquiry or self-awareness. I personally tend to prefer the word, I know Krishnamurti repeatedly emphasized the word self-inquiry. I personally prefer self-awareness, because in contemporary English usage, inquiry, as if it's coming from me. Awareness, partly coming from me, but partly is coming to me. I need to receive something which is being emanated from the spiritual realm the whole time. But it doesn't matter what phrase you use. Words are required, but don't get stuck on any phraseology, mine or anybody else's. So coming back to, there is no such requirement in the scientific research, because the project there is not the transformation of the human being. It's not the transformation of the scientist. Therefore, there is no call for any kind of self-inquiry. I have personally been very grateful having met some extraordinary scientists, particularly at the Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton. Some of them are remarkable human beings, but some, I can assure you, you would not want to invite for tea at home. Because the quality of the scientist has nothing to do with the quality of their science. They may be completely selfish, completely self-centered, can produce great Nobel Prize winning physics. There is a different call in the spiritual realm. It's the very transformation of the being of the person. That's the enterprise. That's the whole project. So therefore, self-inquiry, seriously. Whereas one of the great contributions of modern science, starting from the 16th, 17th century, was in fact insisting that one needs to make observations, not simply to believe something being said in the Bible or anywhere else. In fact, this remark of Galileo, he's actually quoting it from somebody else. It's not originally his remark. That Bible tells us how to go to heaven, but not how the heavens go. How the heavens go requires observation. This was a very fundamental contribution of modern science. Therefore, relying on what we can directly find or observe. But it very soon became almost wholly occupied with external universe. Whereas the whole project in spiritual search has to do with my internal universe. That is what is required to be transformed. And then there is a very fundamental assumption that in principle, the whole external universe can actually be mirrored inside us. In fact, classically, and one can see this much more clearly in the 3rd chapter of the Yoga Sutras by Patanjali, that often became a way of studying natural science. That you focus deeply on something within yourself, and that will reveal to you the workings of external nature, because of the principle that in principle the whole external universe can be mirrored inside us, as if each one of us has a hologram of the entire universe inside us. And therefore, very much more emphasis on self-study, self-knowledge, etc., as I just mentioned here, deeper and deeper and more impartial. Of course, there is a lot of emphasis on direct observation in the sciences as well, naturally, because that's what I just said is one of the major contributions of the science, not simply to just believe something, but to see how does it correspond to what we can observe. But it is important here to recognize that observations in science, and more particularly in physics, which is the queen of the sciences, are made in experiments. Human beings are not experiencing them as we understand the word experience. In fact, in the last at least 100 years, no physics experiment has been conducted by any human beings, because the mind does not experience. All experience is by sensation or feeling. It is very important to realize this. Of course, it is silly to be against the mind. Then the experimental data, experiments essentially is in externalized sensation. How high the mercury is in the thermometer or any other instrument that we are using. So based on all that data, the mind can look at it and suggest something that will include all of this data in one single theory, or even proposed other experiments that can be done or that should be done. So there is no need to be against the mind. There is no need to be against anything. One needs to really find the proper place of everything, even of the devil. So therefore, one needs to understand that the experiment is something quite different from experience. In English, one is a transitive verb, the other is an intransitive verb. I can experience a flower, or I can experiment on a flower. Those two are quite different, have different implications. The kind of experience that is being recommended in the spiritual teachings has to do by closer and closer identity, almost as if it's a state of love. Many of you have heard repeatedly a remark made by Krishnamurti, observer is the observed. Simply to quote that is easy, but to actually see this in practice is not so easy. That observation by identity with what is being observed is a very large undertaking. This is actually the whole definition of samadhi in the Yoga Sutras. Let me now remind you here, first of all, this is in the second chapter of the Yoga Sutra, second sutra, if you're interested. The purpose of yoga is to cultivate samadhi and to diminish all the obstacles. I won't speak about the obstacles now here, but what is samadhi, which is the purpose of yoga to cultivate that? That is described by Patanjali in the third chapter of the third sutra of the third chapter. Samadhi is freedom from myself. Exactly like Christ said, unless you leave yourself behind, you cannot be a follower of mine. Freedom from myself, and then whatever I am looking at is the only thing that is seen. It's almost as if objectivity in the spiritual realm basically means that the subject is out of the way. It's almost like seeing without the seer, or the seer and seen become identified. This is sometimes called the great identity in the Upanishads. But in any case, the point I'm more trying to make, the whole idea here is not that the observer or the experiencer has to be separated from what is being experienced, but to be identified with this, to become one with it. And therefore, the very strong suggestion that unless there is this kind of identity, which is really another expression of love, that knowledge without love is not truth. Let me also return to this idea slightly differently. Because if the progress to be made in spiritual search is come closer and closer to the divine nature, what does it mean, divine nature? More and more consciousness, more and more love. For example, just to remind you, a remark in the first letter of John in the Gospel, not John's Gospel, but first letter of John in the Bible, New Testament, says God is love. This is a very important remark. God is loving is easier to understand. That is a characteristic of God. But to say God is love is to say the very structure of God is love. Similarly, in the Indian tradition, generally, there will be other expressions that are used. Truth, Sat Chit Anand. Truth, consciousness, joy. Different traditions end up emphasizing slightly different things. But in all of those cases, what they are trying to describe is the very structure of whatever we mean by God, whatever the highest reality is. Every teacher says it is impossible to describe this, but nevertheless, their disciples are often asking for some description. So they say certain things indicating it. So therefore, any searcher who comes closer and closer to this particle of divinity naturally oozes out love or compassion or sense of oneness sense of service, which is why I often say, if we were to say that the Buddha was enlightened but was not compassionate, it will be an oxymoron. He cannot be enlightened and not ooze out compassion. Similarly, Christ cannot be the Son of God or regard himself, the Father and I are one, if he is not oozing out love. They don't decide to love. They don't decide to express compassion. It oozes out of them. In fact, this was one of the very strong remarks that Krishnamurti very often made. You don't decide to do good. Goodness needs to ooze out of you. The example he often used to say, a rose does not decide to smell like a rose. We recognize that it is a rose because of its fragrance. So the Buddha or Christ are not deciding to be compassionate or love. It cannot not be the case for them as they come closer and closer to the divine nature. But let me remind you again and again, this is a very large task, because you can find many gurus, cardinals, ministers, monks having all kinds of problems, temptations, because the devil is always there testing everybody. So not to imagine that this is an easy undertaking, but if you now see the contrast with the scientific research, experiments are gathering data, then the mind of a great creative scientist wishes to propose a theory that will include all that data. So the whole enterprise in the scientific realm is to have the observations lead to theory. There is no shortage of theories in the spiritual realm, but there all the theories are meant to lead to experience. If it does not lead to an experience, it's a useless theory. The whole enterprise is different and meant to indicate the quality or enhance the quality of being of the person. That's the project. This is not the project in the scientific realm. So now let me just, because the time is going to be short, so let me just take example of two of the greatest scientists, Newton and Einstein. As you know, Newton's scientific research was absolutely extraordinary. And in fact, more or less a poet in the 18th century, Alexander Pope, wrote this, nature and nature's laws lay hid in night. God said, let Newton be, and there was light. So highly regarded, without question. On the other hand, if you look at the general human nature of Newton, his ego needed to be constantly bolstered. He came from rather a very poor family. He was trying to create some sort of indications of coming from very high levels, making artificial progenies, artificial arrangements. And because his one very important scientist who actually helped him very much in bringing a lot of data, John Flemson, made the following remark, that Newton had a good deal of insidious, ambitious, and excessively covetous of praise. Because he's clearly a very great scientist. Nobody could possibly deny this. But to say that he's a great human being in terms of the quality of his being would be not at all appreciable. On the other hand, anybody who knew Einstein personally often felt that he was somehow among the most religiously oriented person that they had encountered. But he makes this remark, which any sage could have made. The true value of a human being is determined primarily by the measure and the sense in which he has attained freedom from himself. Well, that's what Christ said. That's what Shvetashvara Upanishad said, or Brahmana. So you can see this is the call, and this is what Einstein is saying here. And then, but he's not religious in any formal sectarian sense. In fact, I will make a quotation from him here. I have several other quotations that some of you probably have seen in the written paper. My religion consists of a humble admiration of the illimitable superior spirit who reveals himself in the slight details we are able to perceive with our frail and feeble minds. That deeply emotional conviction of the presence of a superior reasoning power, which is revealed in the incomprehensible universe, forms my idea of God. Very close to many other great philosophers, like Spinoza would say something very similar, or Plato would say something very similar. Shankara would say something very similar, but different expressions. In any case, the point I'm really more trying to make here, that scientific research neither calls for a particular quality of human being, nor does it assist the development of that quality. But it requires a particularly strong mind, a great deal of training, a great deal of understanding. And of course, to make any observations in science, you need the right kind of instruments. But that is the same suggestion in the spiritual realm. In fact, this is the remark of St. Paul, again in the Bible. Eyes of the flesh see the things of the flesh. Eyes of the spirit, the things of the spirit. So how do we cultivate the eyes of the spirit? We can extend our microscopes, telescopes, any other instruments as much as we like. They still remain eyes of the flesh. Eyes of the spirit, in order to cultivate this, require a quiet mind and freedom from all my desires and fears, which I need to understand what they are by an impartial self-inquiry. And then if I or anybody comes closer and closer to that divine nature, compassion, love, sense of service, etc., oozes out of their being. Then they are, as Einstein was saying, to be free of themselves. This is a call that he's calling. And without question, another thing I should mention here, one or two other differences. Scientific research is actually a public affair. Spiritual search ultimately always remains an individual affair. If Einstein publishes a theory and it is verified, then I don't have to waste my time to create that theory. But even if the Buddha, if you like, published the noble truths, I still have to spend my time trying to understand them. So the scientific research is a very public affair. Spiritual search always remains a private affair, individual affair. That doesn't mean that the others cannot assist me. In fact, I have often reminded people that almost the fundamental requirement for any serious spiritual search is to be periodically meeting with fellow searchers. Otherwise, there is always the possibility of either despair, because I see how terrible I am full of jealousy, full of greed, etc. And one can get into despair, because this is what all the things that the devil is going to show me exist in me. Everything exists inside me, including the devil, including God. And then there is this possibility of despair. The other is fantasy. So that is very much, both of these are helped if I'm periodically meeting with some fellow searchers. So this is not to say that nobody else can assist me in spiritual search, but it still ultimately remains my individual search. Also, another thing I should mention here, that in principle, first of all, both scientific research and spiritual search, both of them actually arise from a sense of mystery. something is very mysterious. The whole universe is very mysterious. And in fact, Einstein makes this kind of remark also, that we begin from that mystery. But scientific research, in principle, scientific mysteries can be solved. I myself give you a very simple example. Several years ago, when I was still actively doing physics, I had a couple of PhD students doing physics with me as my students. It would have been irresponsible of me to encourage them to have a problem that cannot be solved. Then they waste their time. It occasionally happens that a problem is wrongly framed, or we don't have sufficiently evolved instruments to actually get the solution or find the data. So it can occasionally happen that a student ends up wasting 2 or 3, 4 years with the wrong problem. But in principle, spiritual mysteries can be solved. But spiritual mysteries cannot be solved even in principle, such as what is God, or who am I, or why am I here? They can sometimes be dissolved. If one doesn't dismiss them, then one does whatever one is actually good at. Einstein will do physics, Uday Shankar will dance, Bach will write music. Everybody does their own unique praise of song for the highest divinity. So science itself can become a spiritual path, which it has become for some people. And just simply to remind you, this is actually a remark of hardly a negligible scientist, Kepler, who said, I am a priest of God in the temple of nature. So scientific research can be a spiritual path. And spiritual search is in any case a science of the interior. That is very much the kind of attitude, not to just take something on belief, but to really see, is it true for me? But it always remains a certain kind of mystery. And I will now end this by quoting to you a very short poem by Rabindranath Tagore, perhaps the greatest poet in India, at least in the 20th century. 3 of his songs are national anthems in 3 different countries. So he's a great poet. And he wrote this poem 13 days before his death in Bengali, which was his mother tongue. But I will say this in English. In the beginning of my life, with the first rays of the rising sun, I asked, who am I? Now, at the end of my life, with the last rays of the setting sun, I ask, who am I? What am I is, or who am I, remains a great spiritual mystery, just because ultimately it is identified with divinity, and one cannot describe what divinity is. Thank you very much. I'll be very happy if you have any comments or questions from anybody.
Thank you very much, dear Professor. That was a very profound and inspiring talk. We'll go back home with a very nice image, like the particle of the spirit inside the temple of matter. And thank you also to remind us that the ego is a good servant, but a bad master. Finally, you gave us some hints about what could we do, talking about self-study as a real path, experiencing by identity. So that's a lot of things we can meditate on that. So now we will enter in that question and answer session. And I will start with the first one. You wrote that no serious human being can be uninterested in either scientific knowledge or inner spiritual search. And Madame Blavatsky told us also that our whole aim and desire are to help in at least some degree toward arriving at correct scientific views upon the nature of man. What could be, for theosophists, the avenue to explore in order to work on this direction?
Well, in fact, one of the areas which is already actually taking place now a little bit I should have mentioned, in fact, in the paper that I sent, I did mention it already. A whole new project has been started about 2 years ago called the Galileo Commission, partly to honor Galileo. That's how it's named after him, because he's often regarded as the father of modern physics, which is regarded as the queen of the sciences. So in the Galileo Commission, the whole idea is to give more importance to consciousness, that consciousness can also exist without matter. To give a very simple human example of this, a fair amount of data has now been gathered in what are called near-death experiences, where, strictly speaking, to the extent that any medical people can determine, the brain is completely dead. But sometimes after a few minutes, sometimes after a few hours, the person comes alive. During that time, there certainly was consciousness, because the person can, when he comes back alive, can even describe what the doctor said to the nurse sitting next to him. So therefore, consciousness can exist without matter. Is now increasingly more and more data being gathered. So this Galileo Commission is actually trying to give a lot of importance to consciousness. Interestingly, that really many great scientists have themselves felt this. Even Max Planck, whose first paper in quantum mechanics was published in 1900, he very much speaks very highly of the importance of consciousness. So it's not that the scientists are not aware of this, but the scientific research is based on as if it begins from matter. So what a good theosophist can do is to point out more and more the importance of consciousness. Things don't always have to be understood only in terms of matter in motion. That is really the point I'm trying to make. In fact, in The Secret Doctrine, Madame Blavatsky and other great sages in other writings, for example, some of you may be familiar with Gurdjieff's Tales to Beelzebub, Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson, actually is the title of the book. There they are describing the origin of the universe and how the various diversifications took place. Some of them don't correspond to our contemporary understanding in science, contemporary cosmology. That doesn't mean that therefore we should dismiss them. Either side needs to be taken seriously. One is coming from the material side, other is coming from the consciousness side. Each of us human beings is a combination of the two. As far as I can see, obviously I have a body, you have a body, that's coming very material part. But we also have some consciousness and even a feeling occasionally of sensing some, usually it gets called truth, love, and beauty. Now, it's impossible to describe these in terms of matter in motion. So one would also have to make room for those, truth, love, and beauty.
Thank you. The next question, we come back to the Buddha story. When Siddhartha was tempted by Mara, Mara's last attempt to corrupt Siddhartha was that he should face Mara himself. So Mara said, "You are at the brink of enlightenment, but I will not allow you to pass. Fight me." Siddhartha said, "No, I will not fight you, because what you fight, you become." And Krishnamurti also said the same. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, well, some of you may have noticed en route in my talk, I had made this remark, not to be against anything, but to find its proper place. Because whatever I am against, because I don't like it or I want to get rid of it, in fact, one cannot get rid of anything by just becoming against it. Temporarily, one may even succeed. But to find the proper place of everything, including of Mara, or you could say selfishness, ego, hankering for pleasure, hankering for money, even that has its place. You and I cannot survive in this world without a certain amount of material goods. Now, should I just go and steal it from a bank, or should I do my hard work to do the proper time and place to get something. So therefore, my suggestion is, and this is very much related with the remark that you just quoted from the Buddha, not to be fighting with the Buddha in the sense of trying to kill him or to be against him. The Buddha didn't actually do that. In fact, he made this remark, Mara, you are a part and parcel of myself. But on the other hand, Mara is not going to lead the whole life of the Buddha. It has its place. Everything has its place. So not to be against anything or therefore to be fighting against it, but to try to understand what is its proper place. Some of you may know of this very great mythological story from India called the Churning of the Milky Ocean, which is really churning of consciousness, in which they ultimately, the devas, which are, if you like, the good guys, are always being beaten by the bad guys. So they ultimately go to Vishnu to help them. So Vishnu says to them that you have to also include the so-called bad guys. The Sanskrit word is Daitya. And the good guys are so-called Aditya, just the opposite of Daitya. But I remind people, both of them have the same father, Kashyap. Now, Kashyap literally means vision. And the bad guys, their mother is Diti, which literally means limited. So they are children of limited vision. And the other mother is Aditi, which means larger or vaster. So they are children of larger vision. There is always going to be a conflict between children of small vision, limited vision, and children of larger vision. But usually children of limited vision have more power. All are military people. All are presidents of every country or prime ministers, have lots of power. So it's very nice to speak about trying to do something for the planet unless we can include them. Sometimes maybe to persuade them, sometimes maybe even to try to teach them or to vote for them or against them. But unless they are included, nothing serious can be undertaken on the planet. So this story of both the Daityas and the Adityas are required. They're children of the same father. Okay.
Thank you. The next question is about action. How is it possible? Is it possible to introduce the spiritual individual search into the academic curriculum of scientific public research study?
It's a very interesting question. Many, many years ago, actually in 1980, I had been myself given a possibility of having enough funds so we could ask bright graduate students in the scientific realm if they could go and spend 3 months or so in a Zen monastery and then come and do their physics research. We actually advertise this, usually in well-known universities like Princeton, Harvard, Yale, because we had been given the possibility of having some funds. But absolutely no bright physics students were interested in undertaking this. They were all competing with each other for the next Nobel Prize, which of course meant for them to do the kind of research that their professors were doing. So the suggestion that they could undertake some serious spiritual search, which will then naturally influence their perspective, their point of thinking, which in my judgment, what is required. If it is actually true that the eyes of the flesh see the things of the flesh, eyes of the spirit, the things of the spirit, how do we cultivate the eyes of the spirit in the scientific realm? So that then we could actually experience and study more deeply those aspects of reality which belong to the eyes of the spirit. That requires a transformation of the scientists. This is something which I have been actually very much speaking about, especially in the Galileo Commission, as I mentioned earlier. And that what we need are transformed scientists. But that's easier said than done. Who wishes to undertake that kind of practice? Since the search seems to be, I was actually so struck at Princeton. I was there this is a long time ago, 1968, 69, that students of one professor in the same department of physics did not even wish to speak to the students of another professor because they are competing with each other for Nobel Prizes. I was so surprised by this. But there we are. That is what is really driving. And also, there is no need to be feeling against the scientific research, but you realize most of the physical scientists are working either for the military or for the industry. Probably 90%. So one needs to see the truth completely clearly and honestly before fantasizing or imagining that people who are doing scientific research are real searchers. Sure, they are searchers of truth in that particular perspective. Then it can get them a good job in industry or military. You can find similar remarks by Einstein, by the way, when he was speaking about Max Planck. He makes very similar remarks about what is driving scientific research.
Thank you. The next question, you spoke about impartial deep self-awareness and that we should examine not just what comes from me, but also what comes to me from the spiritual world. Could you expand on that, on what comes to me a little, please? What do you mean by this in terms of self-awareness? Are you talking about intuition? What comes from the spiritual?
Yes, it's quite interesting that even in the scientific realm, although so much emphasis that everything has to be determined by the mind, many scientists would say they came to their important idea. In fact, Newton makes a similar remarks. And they came to it through, often they would use the word intuition, or they were tired and fed up and gave it up and went to sleep or had a drink, and then suddenly they had some insight that came to them. And intuition is a kind of a feeling. It's a very subtle feeling. And what we need to realize is that feeling is often the first avenue to truth. By feeling, I don't mean ordinary emotion like anxiety or worry or resentment or anger. I mean slightly refined feelings. And here maybe I will be happy to quote to you a well-known scientist. After all, Pascal, everybody knows Pascal. We measure so many, the pressure is measured in so many Pascals. This is what he said. Heart has reasons that reason does not know. We often forget that feeling is often the first receptor of truth, subtler truth. And so whatever we mean by spiritual understanding, sometimes in a quiet moment, which may be in meditation or just going for a quiet walk by yourself. Meditation doesn't mean just sitting down in lotus position. You feel a connection with something larger, higher, something other than myself. That is a feeling connection. Then, of course, the mind can enter, try to understand this, try to elaborate this if necessary. But so there is no need to be against the mind. But as I said earlier, also the mind does not experience. All experience is by sensation or by feeling. And it's too bad the so-called age of enlightenment is completely a wrong name, because there the emphasis was that everything has to be understood by the mind, which is why I remind people it's very difficult to find even a single well-known poet after the 18th century who was happy with this scientific assumption. Because after all, if physicists are the only avenues of truth, what about poets or artists or painters? They have nothing, or musicians, they have nothing to contribute to finding truth. William Blake, a well-known English poet, this is what he said. Newton, Locke was a philosopher about the same time in the 18th century, very much supporting Newton. And Bacon was the president of the Royal Society of England. So Newton, Locke, and Bacon are members of an infernal trinity. You can find any other poet, Goethe or Wordsworth, Keating, anybody. None of them are happy with this general assumption coming from science that matter is the primary reality and everything needs to be understood in terms of matter in motion. This doesn't make any sense to any poet or any musician.
Thank you, Ravi. The next question, it is a question about an additional dimension of science and spirit that so many young women ask about. What are your thoughts about more recent advances as feminism in science, in which we understand that the observer cannot be removed from the experiment? For example, Ananda Mahima, another woman saint and scientist, explain science and spirituality from the perspective of the divine feminine, the mother, a very different vibration and approach.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things which I like to warn people about, there is a very strong, almost an assumption now everywhere, as if since science is the main avenue of truth, therefore whatever anybody says from wherever it is coming from should somehow be justified by science. In fact, all the great spiritual teachers, including even Krishnamurti, was always somehow happier to have some Nobel Prize winner in science sitting next to him, which in my judgment is a very tragic idea, because it just assumes that scientific approach is the only approach to truth, and if the spiritual search can be verified by that kind of scientific approach, then it can be acceptable. Now, in fact, one forgets, Krishnamurti himself actually said to me that scientists seem to be the last people to understand what he's talking about. They seem to be too clever for their own good, was one of his expressions. Now, there is a very strong tendency to somehow justify everything coming from the spiritual world in terms of science, especially if one well-known scientist says something. Here, I would like to also remind you that most of the remarks that we quote from well-known scientists, you cannot find them in any scientific journal. For example, even the remark I quoted from Kepler, that I am a priest of God in the temple of nature. You cannot find this in any scientific journal or book. Similarly, a remark of Einstein often gets quoted, religion without science is blind, science without religion is lame. If anybody can show me this in any scientific journal, I will be very surprised. The point I'm trying to make, actually, in general, what scientists say is not what science says, which may surprise some of you, but take this seriously, try to consider this. What science says, it cannot possibly have anything to say about whether God exists or doesn't exist. It's not a scientific problem. But of course, scientists are human beings. They also fall in love. They also are afraid of death. They also see a friend dying. Then they wonder what happened. So because they are human beings, based on whatever they know about science, they make some general remarks, such as Einstein or Kepler or Newton. All of these people make some remarks because they are human beings. But most of the remarks that get quoted by them, you will never find this in any scientific journal or a scientific book, I can assure you. So be very careful, just trying to justify everything that Krishnamurti said, oh, because David Bohm was a physicist, therefore blah, blah, blah. I try to point out to people, whatever we now know in physics, almost all of it was unknown 120 years ago. So give some importance, that these scientists have some intelligence. In the next 120 years, they will find something more. Or maybe next 1200 years, they will find something more. But that won't change what the Buddha said or what Christ said. So to imagine that contemporary science is now proving what the Buddha said or Christ said or Krishna said is quite crazy in my judgment. People just forget science is an evolving project. It will change in its nature. Other things will be found. There will be other great scientists. So allow some more credit to the scientists and not to imagine that we have come to the end.
Thank you, Ravi. We will start with the last question. We are reaching almost the end of the slot. So we said that reality is oneness, and each aspect of it that we perceived, either through the mind knowledge acquisition or through the revelation intuition, belong to reality. So the question is there a way to reconcile both language and methodology to reach a holistic vision of reality?
Well, really, reality is a very tricky expression because almost everything that we see, first of all, if you like, purely from a spiritual or a philosophical point of view, repeatedly it gets said that this is all Maya, this is illusion. The reality is something far subtler. Similarly, from a physics point of view, you can look at my hand here and think this is solid. Any physicist will tell you there's mostly empty space in here. So what we ordinarily see is not reality. The call really is, again and again, to see with the appropriate instruments. Of course, in the scientific world, that has a different meaning than it does in the spiritual world. And therefore, what are the right instruments? And then what one sees through them. For example, the whole of the great discovery of the bosons or the so-called God particle, which was really a wrong label, as you probably know. It actually was labeled by the physicists who wrote a book called the goddamn particle because they were unable to find it. But the publisher suggested it will sell better if you called it the God particle. You can find this on Google if you like. The so-called God particle was actually called the goddamn particle because it was not being discovered. So one can, but then that is one kind of particle coming from certain kind of instruments. But is this what the Buddha is seeing when he sees reality? I don't believe this personally. But I know there is a very strong tendency, first of all, to try to explain everything in terms of science. And these days, everything can be explained in terms of quantum mechanics, just because nothing is, it's all probability, everything can be explained. No, I actually invite people not to be so easily seduced by having to explain in terms of science. Science itself is a very limited enterprise to reality. That doesn't mean one needs to be against it. Just because this is one of the things it does, and you and I won't be even able to speak on Zoom without the whole scientific discoveries behind it. So there is no reason to be against it, to find its proper place. It allows much of the contemporary transformation or transportation as well as information is conveyed through scientific discoveries. So we need to be grateful for that, but not to be seduced by it. That's the remark. Okay.
And we want to be grateful to you for that great talk and question and answer session. Thank you very much, dear Ravi. So this session is over. Thank you very much. And we move to the next step in the agenda, which is the meditation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. God bless you all.